Hey, I'm John Bobrow. I'm CEO and founder of Move 38, a new kind of game company. Today, I'm going to dig a little bit back through my history, and I've got a special guest, Celia Pearce, joining us. Hey, Celia.
Hi.
And Celia and I have a really fun backstory, and we're going to use our conversation as a lens to talk about play and its value in community and community building. And I'm going to give a little bit of background about some of my history and kind of what I've built. And I think Celia is the perfect person with the perfect lens to not only help me articulate some of these things, but hopefully arrive at some of the deeper nuances of things I probably didn't even realize were happening as I've been building not only the products or creating the artworks and building the company. And I think all of that is going to sum around this importance of play. And so just to start out a little bit, just so everybody has a bit of context, I'm going to give a little bit of background on myself, and then Celia, I'll give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. Growing up, I was always a misfit. I was a hybrid between math and art. And these days we have things like STEM and STEAM, and this idea that science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and if we insert art into the mix, might be even a little bit more valuable. That was not around when I was growing up, and I always took everything apart. My father was an educator, and my mother was an artist. I grew up oil painting. As I had entered the workspace where I built interactive art installations, museum installations for places like the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago or Smithsonian, I was applying both of these skills, the art and math side, a lot. And museums in particular were a good space to think about how people interact with the kinds of things I was making. It wasn't isolated or living in a library. It wasn't, it was very much part of an active conversation. And so as a designer, which was really kind of what my role was, as a designer, I had to think a lot about the kinds of things I was building and creating, whether it be writing software or building hardware. And that led me to join a place called the MIT Media Lab, which is an innovation lab inside of Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And at the Media Lab, I was part of a group called Playful Systems. My focus there was to think about and build tools for creative thought, and specifically around cooperation. And while I was at the Media Lab, I happened to create a set of tools for creativity, these little hexagonal tiles. And these little hexagonal tiles were, for myself, kind of a artistic experiment. They were an answer to a what if question. And my goal for them was for people to engage with them and think about simple singular actions, and then see how the whole was greater than the sum of their parts. And while I was building this, I happened to meet Celia. And so maybe I'll let Celia kind of introduce yourself and share a little bit about how we met. And then I can come back and share a little bit more about what I've been building for the past 4 years at this point.
Currently, I am a college professor at Northeastern University, right across the river from MIT Media Lab. I'm also the co-founder of IndieCade, which is an independent game festival, which is highly implicated in the story of Blinks. And also, I'm a game designer. And my focus of my work, really for the entire time I've been doing game design since the mid-'80s, has been on social interaction. It has been on the sort of balance between cooperation and competition. The first projects that I did were in a sort of nightclub setting. It was a prototype for a nightclub with social games. And we never actually built it, but we did a ton of prototyping and playtesting. And one of the things that I absolutely fell in love with during that period was emergent behavior. Emergent behavior is when players do things that the game designer has not anticipated. And I was particularly excited by social emergent behavior. What happens when you put people together in a mediated context and that somehow changes their behavior in an interesting way. And I kept seeing this again and again. One of my first jobs at that particular company was to run the playtesting program. And so I spent many, many hours building prototypes and watching people play games and observing their behavior, and was really, really transfixed by it. And this really led to my much later in life PhD, which was kind of an interesting hybrid between game design and social science. And I wrote a book called Communities of Play based on that research, which was about a group of game refugees who immigrated from a game that closed into other virtual worlds. And one of the things they did was they tried to recreate the culture of the game that closed. And going back to Jonathan's opening comment, for me, the intersection between play and creativity is really interesting. And I've talked a lot in my writing about the idea of productive play, which kind of goes against some game scholarship around play as inherently unproductive. And what I found is actually it's not, it's highly productive, and people often will parlay play activities into creative activities. So what you see with the virtual community that I studied is that they start out playing and they end up making. And so this is something I think that's really relevant to Blinks and really relevant to Jonathan's work and the sort of intersection between play and creation. And I also want to just add one thing, because you mentioned something about STEAM, and I like STEAM, but I feel like STEAM is almost, it suggests that there isn't any art in STEM, and that's just not true. So I take exception with this idea that art is somehow an add-on to engineering, or that they were not unified to begin with, because as we know, many of the great engineering feats of our culture have been the direct result of artists doing experimentations with art making. So for instance, photography was invented by an artist, film was invented by artists. We see this convergence of engineering and art constantly and throughout history. And yet somehow we've gotten to this point where we think that art is separate from STEM. And I think that that's not the case. And to me, you're kind of like the way it ought to be, the Renaissance person that is thinking in an artistic way about technology.
I've always tried to avoid saying it in some ways when you think about like who are the people who influence you or who you'd like to emulate or who you'd, but I realized in growing up also that I was like so heavily influenced by this whole hybrid, and I think oftentimes you'd say like polymath, but that word always bothered me. It just feels too, I don't know, it feels exclusionary rather than inclusionary. And, but you know, people like Da Vinci, it was just like, wow, this is an inventor and an artist. And like, why is there a wall between these two things?
Exactly, or, you know, Méliès, who was an incredible engineer and an amazing artist who basically invented film special effects, right? So these are people who really, to them, there's no distinction between art and technology. They're one and the same. And I feel that way myself as well.
We come at a very similar topic, but from two slightly different worlds. And I constantly see parallels here. But as you were giving your intro, I was thinking about the fact that you're talking about all of your work in these virtual worlds. And I realized it's probably a good opportunity for me to also clarify that what Move 38 has built is very much not in a virtual world. And so it's something that may not be obvious. And so maybe I'll just take a moment to describe Move 38 and Blinks. And I think also it'll come back nicely to our meeting. 4 years ago, I founded Move 38, and the goal of the company is to raise a generation of systems thinkers. My feelings is that the toys and tools we play with, they shape the way we think. And oftentimes, I think maybe it's Ian Bogost who says that, you know, these are objects of carpentry. They're things we hold and think with. And I think of chess pieces that way. They were objects of my childhood, that the weightiness of them, the way that we interacted with them, the respect you paid to them or gave to them, helped you think deeply about really important things. And I realized that in almost all my examples, I'm talking about atoms, not bits, and I'm talking about the physical world. And so when I built interactive museum installations, we actually built physical museum installations. And when I founded Move 38, I wanted to take that experience of these physical, playful experiences and take this futuristic concept of the idea that the objects in the future can respond to our touch, can communicate with each other, can act in ways much like our computers, but we can have those things in our hand. We can hold them, and they can. So to describe Blinks real quickly, Blinks is the world's first smart tabletop game system. It's played with intelligent game pieces. I'm just gonna hold one up. They look like this. On the top of them is this sort of custom soft membrane surface, and they light up, they illuminate and glow and animate, and they're magnetic so that they attach to one another and they communicate with one another. And each one of them knows different games, and those games can be taught to all of the Blinks. So when I want to play a game called Honey about building an ecosystem in a hive, I can load that game onto all the Blinks, kind of like a Nintendo system, and then play that game. I won't talk that much more about the game system itself, but I want to talk about what I think the best area for this conversation to go to is the community that was formed around it and why it was formed around it, and the way we structured, really the way we structured Blinks to enable that. And so Blinks is an open source project, which means that we freely, openly share the software, the code, that allows you to make games or experiments on Blinks. And so anybody has the ability to make their own games. And it didn't start that way. I always knew I wanted to make an open source tool for creativity. But I think this is actually the perfect time to talk about our meeting.
It's funny because I got into online games because of the social aspect, but I wanted to get back to tangible work as well. And so right around the time I met Jonathan, I had come over to Northeastern from Georgia Tech, where I worked before. And I joined an art department, and I did it very deliberately because I wanted to really focus on game making, sort of shift from the social science aspect, where I was applying the things I had learned from my anthropology work to game design and going back to this idea of emergent design. And so I developed with a colleague, Jillian Smith, and two students, this game called EB. And EB is an electronic quilt that also, by the way, involves hexagons. And the way this works is that we developed this way of creating electric connections by using conductive Velcro. And so each of these pieces has a piece of conductive Velcro attached to some conductive fabric on the front. And if you place them on the Velcro and then you connect them, you put two pieces on the Velcro with the fabric, you basically create a live electrical connection. And so the game was very strategic, and it was about creating these channels to light up these islands. So we were at an event at Harvard called Tech Poetics, which is very apt for the conversation about tech and art. And we were at opposite ends of this row of tables. And one of my students came back to our demo and said, "There's another game down there that has a hexagonal grid. You should go take a look at it." And that was the beginning of a beautiful relationship.
Celia comes over and she goes, I hear you've got hexagons. And she sees what I'm building. And I've built, these little hexagonal circuit boards at that point. But Celia recognized immediately the potential on these, which was really cool. She saw them and she said, is there any chance I can bring students over to your lab and see what we can make on these? And my eyes lit up because I was like, oh, I've been working so long and hard at like making this an easy thing to build for. And, I said, yeah, how about you come over? How about 3 hours? We'll set aside 3 hours so we can brainstorm for an hour. We have an hour to write code and then an hour to play test the game. And I think, what was your response, Celia?
Well, I said, well, how long would it take us to make a prototype? And you said about 3 hours. And I was like, I don't believe you, but okay, you're on. And we jumped in my car and drove over after all the detours that Cambridge always inevitably hands you, and went to the media lab. I went with the 2 students that worked on this game with me. And we had an idea that we had been working on that we were going to try to implement as a field game. And the idea of the game was we wanted to create a game where you were rewarded for essentially for being in a diverse group. And the idea of the original game was actually I wanted everyone to wear hats. It was called Diversity. And you would have hats that looked like buildings, and there would be different color of these building hats. And the goal of the game was to be surrounded by people that were a different color than you. And that was this, and we wanted to do something for about 30 people. We actually tried to play test this on a couple of occasions, and it was almost impossible to get 30 people together to try it out. But that was what we brought to Jonathan. We were like, I think this might work on your platform really nicely. Let's just give it a shot.
And so I remember writing this up on a glass window at the lab. And, we outlined the idea that a tile is happier when it's surrounded by a more diverse grouping. And we played around with it. We ended up coding it in an hour. Your students, I believe, contributed on that code, at least programmed.
Yeah, I think they did, yeah.
And that was the first time I had ever let anybody make something for this platform I had been building, which was really so amazing. The jump from making something and then sharing it with people is a big jump. But this was a jump of making something and then letting somebody else try and make something with it. And it's like, it sheds so much light on how unique everyone's perspective is. And then immediately in the process of doing that, everybody who was there that day was like, hey, can we make another game? And so it started with one idea, which was, yeah, let's see if we can make a game for this system. This looks like a game system. But then it turned into, well, that was pretty fast. That was pretty easy.
And can I just add one thing there? It was also fun. And I think this is really interesting because for us, making a game for Blinks is fun. And that's why it's been so successful as a game jam platform, because the experience of making the game is itself kind of game-like. And I think that for me, part of what I was doing was I have this method that I call affordance-based design, which is where you try to learn about the technology. So once we pitched this idea to John, then we grilled him about what can this do? How do these magnets work? What kind of information can be passed? What are the different ways the lights can circulate, can blink or whatever? And really, I just got like the lowdown on what this thing could do in every conceivable variation. And the thing that I remember for me that was the most revelatory moment was when we got to the first prototype and we were talking about moving the pieces around, and we realized that because they were magnetic, you can't just lift them out of the middle and move them around. And this is where the game went from being diversity to being fracture, which was, what if we pulled the entire board apart? And the way that you moved your pieces around was not by moving individual pieces, but by actually breaking the board apart and reconfiguring it. And to me, this was so great, because I said to John, this is the only platform I know that has the affordance that makes this possible. You cannot do this with a standard board game because it doesn't have the magnets. And the magnets were, I mean, I know they were important to the design, but I don't think we realized that they were going to play such a big role in the playability of the system. And I just remember going, wow, this is something really new and different that we can only do with this platform.
I love that. And I feel like that was, to be honest, when I chose to, like, the magnet's strength was very purposeful. The magnet's self-oriented, but it was actually a bit to my, I just wanted the pieces to align nicely. I wanted them to be, you know, grouped properly. And I felt like, you know, that feeling of like you set out like a grid of tiles and then somebody bumps into it and they all like shift a little bit and there's that rivers between them. Like, it was like, nah, you're going to be playing with these things on a table. They can provide their own structure. But I didn't anticipate, when you talk about emergent properties, emergent behavior, and the fact that it just came out of us playing with them. And like, people just fiddle with them. The moment I put blinks in front of people, they, you know, it's like,
start playing with them,
listening to the sounds they make, or stacking them, or dropping them, or sliding them. And just from that, like, it's interesting. I mean, I think part of me, like, this is one of the reasons why I get so excited about this space and think about play, is that it's the act of playing that enables you to enter spaces, have ideas, come up with solutions that you wouldn't, you know, you get all these freedoms of play. And if you design an object to encourage play, whether it be with blinks and making a game for them, or our lead developer who said, I can't think about any problem the same way anymore, you've totally reoriented the way I think about systems. And,
yes.
you know, he used to build the software that ran high frequency trading. And now he's going, how do I think about these problems where everything is equal and interacting with each other?
That's what emergence is. Emergence is bottom up, right? It's things happening based on individual small interactions that make a larger cumulative interaction.
Yeah.
I want to add something about this play-based innovation, because it's also something I've been thinking a lot about, especially over the last 13 years that I've been co-running IndieCade.
Can you quickly tell us what IndieCade is in a sense?
Oh, yes. So I am a co-founder of IndieCade, which is the International Independent Game Festival. It's the largest standalone game festival in the United States. And we have been promoting independent games since 2007, both through showcases that we do for various industry events and also through our standalone festivals and exhibitions. So we have been doing this since 2007, before there was really an indie scene. And there were some really key things that have happened historically along the way vis-a-vis technology that they think are really interesting. The first was the advent of iOS. So when we started in 2007, iOS was brand new. One of the things that was really interesting to me about what happened with the iOS platform in terms of games is that that was a phone technology. It was designed to be a phone, a smartphone. But people who were doing independent games were doing really weird shit with it. They were going, oh, there's an accelerometer in this. How can I mess around with that? And there were a couple of games, actually. One is a guy you're working with, I think, which is Henry Smith, right? Which is Space Team. Space Team was, like, to me, one of the greatest examples of people who design play are not trying to solve problems. They're trying to figure out how to make things more fun. It releases aspects of technologies that are beyond what they were meant for. And exactly that same pattern happened when the Oculus came out. And as you know, they sponsored us immediately after their Kickstarter was completed. And we've been working with them ever since to help them build content for their platform, because they recognized that that's where the innovation was going to come from. So I think you really hit the nail on the head. And I feel like Blinks is, I use it a lot as an example. I use it actually as a case study of something that actually started as an academic research project, because people in indie games don't want to talk about that. and then what you did was you went out and you actively cultivated creative partnerships like the one, you know, as developer zero for Blinks that you did with us. But then you did the game jam at New View, and we did the game jam at IndieCade. And in each of those instances, somebody came up with something that you had never thought of to do with your technology.
I love that you use Space Team as an example. If you're watching this and haven't heard of the game, it's an amazing experience. I feel like that's actually a really good segue into an area that I'd love to continue to dig into, which is community and kind of how that evolved over these past 4 years. And you brought up that Oculus Rift, the VR headset, was kickstarted. That's how it got its start. And similarly, Move38 has launched, at this point, 4 different Kickstarters, 2 of which supporting the Blinks platform. And I think that's worth noting as well. Kickstarter's crowdfunding platform where you have the ability to take an idea and execute it in the way that you and the community you're building it for actually envision, rather than having external forces pulling something in one direction or another. And I feel like, I just say that because I feel like it was so important for Blinks to be able to be published by Move38 and not Hasbro, Mattel, or Lego, because they wouldn't have the same freedom to operate in all honesty, not profitable ways that Move38 started to operate as. I operated the company as an artist and a designer, and I didn't operate it as a profitable endeavor. And at this point, you know, the team has grown and we're building it into a business that grows. And but I think it's important to start there. I actually, one of my colleagues, this is a little bit of a sidebar, but one of my colleagues says that MBAs you shouldn't be allowed to get a business degree without a secondary degree. You shouldn't be able to just be a master's in business. You need something to work with. And I think a similar concept there is there's no point in learning a language if you don't have something to say. You first
Yes. I want to build on something you mentioned, because I think Kickstarter is a really interesting part of this formula. And the reason I say that is that Kickstarter has been a game changer in terms of what is fueling the development of new game platforms. Most of the people that support game platform Kickstarters, and this includes both Blinks and Oculus, are creators. Most of the people that made Oculus happen, and they got something like 20 times more than their original asking amount. Most of those people did that because they wanted to make something with it, not because they wanted to make money. And it's interesting, like, as you know, people, and we have Kickstarter is also an IndieCade sponsor. We know those guys really well, and games has long been their top, their top category. And that is driven by people who are creative people who don't even they're not interested in making money. They're not even that interested in necessarily getting something, except for the play. The DK1 was, I get the development kit before anyone else, right? I get to make stuff with this before anyone else gets their hands on it. And that's exactly what the first round of Blinks was. People were, this is cool. I want to make something with it. And so what they're buying from you is the right to be creative, which is the whole productive play formula as an economic model that I write a lot about is like, if you go into Second Life, for instance, you actually pay them for the right to make their world. And so it's kind of a similar idea. People are paying you, in a sense, they're paying Move 38 for the right to create with that platform. And this is a totally different economic model. And I think, honestly, I have yet to meet an MBA that if I talk to about this would look at me and go, oh yeah, I totally get what that, I get that business model. I don't think anybody in the business end of things has any idea what is going on with this.
In the 4 years of building this company, in about year 3, we realized we wanted to grow and scale what we were doing. And the people we found to grow and scale it with, you know, are investors. And, you know, Move 38 is at a point where we're holding meetings with venture capitalists. And one of the things that one of our investors and advisors brought up the other day was like, John, not only did you invent a technology or a tool, but you also invented a new vertical, right? Smart tabletop is not a thing. But he's like, you're also trying to invent a new business model.
And this is part of what really has fueled my passion for IndieCade over all these years, is that most people making games in that context are doing it before there's a business model. We are always ahead of the curve on the business model. And I think where Oculus and also you and a few other people that we've worked with over the years, and notably not Apple, but Oculus, and I think some of this has to do with the fact that some of the key people there are from my generation. I made VR things in the 90s, and they didn't want to have happen the second time what happened the first time, which was there were too many different technologies and not enough content. And the Oculus model was, let's have one technology, let's make it easy to develop for. Like the smartest thing those guys did, other than of course sponsoring IndieCade, was to partner with Unity. Because that was the first time in the history of VR that anyone had partnered with a software engine to make it easier to make content. And that was genius, because now all these people are making games for it. And so whether or not Oculus is or was the best VR headset is irrelevant. There's more content for it than any other platform. And so it will win either way because of that. And I think what you're talking about is you've extended this business model into this idea of a tangible object. So like, imagine you buy a deck of cards, but then you have to pay a little extra for every game. Oh, I want to play blackjack. Okay, I have to pay a little money to get blackjack for these cards. It's a system. And so there's a whole economic model that doesn't exist yet, and that we need to figure out how, and I say we as your friend and collaborator, we need to figure out what is the economic bedrock of this, so that you can continue to do what you love to do and have a viable business that's sustainable.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing the start of that, right? Like I think in the past 2 Kickstarters, and then the traction we're seeing, and a lot of people looking for things to connect. On the back of the box it says connect by disconnecting, and the idea here is that like I wanted to put this focus on, you know, the in-person social experience of tabletop games. And I think just to come back to what you were saying about the communities and creators, so players that are also creators, that's anybody. Like anybody can play with something and create. I want to bring up, you brought up a term when we were talking 2 weeks ago, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about this, and because I think you can define it and then we'll talk about it. You said this is an autodidactic community, and what does that mean? And how did I accidentally build one?
So this is actually a term that I coined back in the 90s in my first book, which was called The Interactive Book. And it was very early in the sort of hacker scene. And one of the things I noticed that was really interesting was that people were having this really, first of all, it was very common for people to be self-taught, including myself. But more importantly, it was very common for people to be self-teaching each other somehow. Like if people wanted to learn something, instead of going to a teacher or a school, they would call their friend or they'd email their friend, whether it was another university professor or another hacker, whatever, and say, hey, do you know why this isn't working? Or is there a plugin I can use for this or whatever? And so this is what I started to dub autodidactic communalism. And you know, in the virtual worlds that I studied back in the knots, basically, this was the standard. People were teaching each other how to do stuff. And it became this very horizontal idea about it's on-demand learning. It's I learn things when I need to learn them because I want to do something. That's the kind of, and that's actually, there's a scientific, in the learning sciences, that's called situated learning. It means I'm not learning something and then doing something with that knowledge. It's I'm learning something in order to do something. And of course, at the MIT Media Lab with Mitch Resnick and Papert and all the other people there, that they kind of really pioneered that as a way to drive technological innovation, right? Is create technologies that people can teach themselves to use while they use them. And I might add, as a Montessori brat, I was already pre-programmed to think this way. So I think that this idea of creating objects, I mean, to me, like Blinks is very Montessori-esque in the sense that it teaches you how to use it by using it. And that's what an autodidactic tool is in the Montessori. That's where I got the term autodidactic from. It's a Montessori term, actually.
You stole autodidactic from the objects, that the affordances of the objects allow you to learn how to use the objects. And you said, I'm going to appropriate that, and I'm going to talk about communities that actually form and inform each other, and therefore make progress, become more creative, create things that maybe wouldn't have thought of. Is that right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. And I mean, I think it's funny because Montessori, when she talked about an autodidactic artifact object, I think she was often imagining one child interacting with one artifact. And I don't know that she necessarily thought as much about the group, you know, that kids were going to be doing these things together.
I think that this is I think this is so important. So play and the objects we play with, oftentimes I think about, okay, you're playing with simulacra of everyday problems, or you're engaging with, you know, and you're problem solving in fun ways. You're doing it voluntarily. You're having fun doing it. But I think, and I was writing about this the other day, is that my most memorable moments in my life are the ones that I've spent with other people. They're these social interactions. There's something about we're so social in nature that those moments are so formative to us. And play, while it's a great thing to do alone, there's lots to be learned there. When you're doing it with others, I swear, you're firing 10 times as many synapses as you are when you're playing alone. And I think that...
And also, I want to say this, because this is one of my soapboxes. I remember when multiplayer games became a thing in the 90s, and I kept saying to people, no. They've always been a thing. They've only stopped being a thing for like a decade because of computers. But historically, there was never any such thing as a single player game until computers. You wouldn't be like, oh, I'm going to play backgammon by myself. I mean, solitaire is what you do when you don't have anyone to play cards with, right?
That's exactly right.
I think the single player game, I mean, it has its value for sure. And it's obviously become a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's a historical aberration in many ways.
Can I also tell a real quick story about, so I think this is hilarious. So Solitaire, which is this game that you would only play by yourself if you didn't have people to play cards with, talking about autodidactic tools, when Microsoft Windows had to teach people how to use a mouse, and you needed to learn how to use a mouse because nobody knew what that was, they installed 2 games on all of their machines, default, to inform you how to use that tool. Are you aware of this?
Vaguely?
The first game was Minesweeper.
Yes.
And so
I remember this.
Minesweeper teaches you how to click with the left click, and it teaches you how to right click because you needed to mark the mines with the right click. You know, of course you have to move around the mouse, but you're getting the left click and the right click. And that's how they taught that to you. And then Solitaire, do you know what that was teaching you? It was teaching you how to drag. People had never had this concept of clicking and dragging before.
Yes.
So they installed these two games and it was default. You couldn't buy a computer without them. And so through gameplay, people were teaching themselves how to use a computer.
Although, since we're going down this path, I just want to say a few things about computer interfaces. When I was working at ESI Design in the 80s in New York, when I first started there were 30 people on 2 floors, and each floor had one PC. They were DOS PCs with green text on a black background. And when you would turn them on, there would be a little A that would blink. And if you didn't know what to say to it, you could not use it. You had to know its language. You had to know what to tell the computer in its own language in order to use it. Every program that I used had a different set of commands for the function keys. So on one program, it might be that F3 was delete, and on another, it might be save. And so we would have to get these plastic covers to put over the keyboard so that we would know which controls went with which piece of software. And then I was, my boss leased me out to another company for a week. He said, they want to work with you, just go down there and do some writing for them. And I go down and I have my little floppy DOS disk all ready to go with WordPerfect on it. And I get there and they go, oh, no, we don't do that. We have all our software's on the central server, blah, 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 and we don't have WordPerfect. So they stuck me in front of a Macintosh. I'd never touched one before in my life. It's 1985-ish, 6-ish. I'm like, I don't know how to use it. And I said, you'll figure it out. It just click, drag, drag down, click, blah, blah, blah. And in 20 minutes, I was writing. And when I got back, I went to the IT department and I said, I don't want a PC anymore. I want a Macintosh. And I never turned back. So this is part of the problem with the Windows platform, is that they needed that to teach in the first place. That was a flaw in the interface.
I have to put one more note, which was the Mac. They never introduced a right click. Microsoft built their own problem by having a right click. They had to explain.
Yes.
That's true.
I want to go back to this idea of systems as an engine for creativity, because I think that it's worth just saying a little bit about Lego. I'm sure that Lego is something you've thought a little bit about. And I was actually a consultant for the company Lego in the late 90s. And when you work for Lego, one of the things they do is they make you go through this indoctrination center, which is kind of a museum about the history and the philosophy of Lego. And they very much, and this goes back, Lego basically came out after World War II, originally as wooden blocks and then eventually plastic. Which, by the way, caused a huge to-do because plastic was this new technology and it freaked all the wood people out. But anyway, so when I went there, they had this VR lab, and they were very much about this idea of systems for people to play with that teach you about how to use them by using them, and that allow you to do an infinite variety of things with a limited number of components. And this is also, as a side note, my dad's whole thing of building systems. My dad, Peter Pearce, has designed building systems that are based on the same idea, a limited number of components with an infinite array of affordances that allow for an infinite array of outcomes. And so I think that's exactly what Blinks does in a super elegant way, because it has a very simple, very easy to explain, even though it's this weird alien technology, it's actually super easy to explain what it does, right? I mean, you can literally in 30 seconds, you can say, it's this thing, it's got lights, you can program it, and boom. And that's just a very, a gross oversimplification, because it ends up that those affordances are very nuanced and can actually do a lot of different things.
I'll show real quickly. I'll hold it up because I might as well show so everybody can see it. But so I'm just gonna hold these up. So these are 5 blinks, all with different games. And I'm just gonna take one called Zenflow, and by holding it down, it'll go into a teach mode. We can call this blink sync. And when it touches the others, it finds each of its neighbors and they teach each other how to play the game. And so you can actually see the process of the game hold from blink to blink. And they kind of play this little game of telephone. And then when they're done, we'll see them all do a little dance and then, okay, and so we're done. And so now they're all running this new same piece of code. They're all, and so it's funny, somebody asked about that animation on the loading. How did we come up with it? And I said, it actually was just telling us exactly what it's doing. We needed a debug screen. And so that blue light that you're seeing pass from blink to blink, it grows in brightness or dims in brightness for every piece of information that it sends. And so if the chain is broken and it can't send information from one to the other, you see the light stop. It stops going up and down. And you know, oh, the flow has stopped. That is literally the flow of information. It's a one-to-one translation. In building things, I mean, when you talk about the affordances of materials and like, that's something that's, I think for people to be able to work together and work quickly or easily get into something, the more the material or the platform sort of suggests a common understanding of the way it's used, the easier it is for people to then communicate and use it. And
I think it's also, I mean, with blinks, there's a couple things. First of all, that there is an HCI sensibility. I mean, you really want the blink to tell you what it's doing, which is what you just illustrated. So that's really important. But the other thing that I have to say, I mean, just to talk it up a little bit, because I love it so much. Going back to the Lego example, I mean, there are so many different pieces and types of Lego components. There's only one kind of blink. And this is what amazes me is one thing, they all do exactly the same thing. They're all the same technology, but they can do a lot of different things because of the way you've designed them. And specifically this idea that a blink is essentially a storage medium for a game that then can teach it to the other tiles. And this means you can literally make an infinite number of games for it.
Yeah, and I haven't actually, I realized I noted to talk about this a little bit, but on that note of making games for it, I think we had talked about, I think we had sold 250 developer kits, to our initial 1,000 customers. So 1 in 4 of those customers said, I want to also create games for them. And then this May, that 250 game design community more than doubled. We had an additional 350 people purchase our new developer kits in May of this year. And so this community's grown immensely. And now our forum, I think I was showing you, is seeing people posting every single day, new games, new creations, new explorations. One of the ones isn't a game at all. It's called a terrarium. And the creator of it saw these objects and thought, well, I can make one of them represent sunlight and another one be soil and another one water, and started to post their process online. And people started to follow along. And now that's being reviewed by a jury at IndieCade. And it's, just seeing the creations pop up and people, I think the thing that surprised and delighted me most is not just people creating things, but the way they talk to each other in this community, the way they interact with each other. There's a sense of respect and there's a sense of helping each other out. And because it's play, there's, I think, like, oh, let me try that out. Or,
right. Right.
I want to play with it. I want to share that. And I think that's one of the neatest things for me is seeing the way people have taken it upon themselves to help each other play with what each other are making. And I feel like, I don't know, if I could give anything to the world, like it would be making it easier for people to engage with each other in productive ways. I think that play brings people together in productive ways, in ways that delight each other and make us laugh, make us smile. I think I've told you this story. A lot of people go, Move 38, where did that come from? And what does it mean?
I don't even know.
You don't know?
No.
So I have to tell the story here. So Move 38. So 6 years ago, the world's best Go player was beaten by a computer, an AI. So Go was thought to be so complex that a computer would never be able to beat a human because you have to be creative to play the game. There's not enough atoms in the universe to compute all of the possible arrangements on the board for Go. So you can't brute force it. You can't simply hand it to a computer and say, solve for the best move, because it doesn't have enough time in the world to do it. And so 6 years ago, an AI built by a team now owned by Google, AlphaGo, challenged the world's best Go player to a match. And in the second match, professional players are watching and they're commentating and they're talking about, okay, well, if the computer is smart, it'll make a move like this. Oh, look, it moved like that. Great move. And they were predicting all of the moves, right? The pros had intuition about where it would move. Well, there was one moment in the second match where the computer makes a move that no single professional player predicted. It happened to be a good move, and that move was the 37th move of that game.
Oh.
Move 38 is the human response to playing with systems. My feeling is that if we play with toys and tools that shape the way we think, that player could have had, how would that have gone differently? Would there be intuition? Can we think in systems? And so that's Move 38.
That's great. I love that. And I think that's a perfect place to end the conversation.
Thanks, Celia, so much. This has been...
Oh, it was so fun. Yeah, it was really fun.